So the sociological imagination is a term coined by C. Wright Mills in his book called The Sociological Imagination, which was published in 1959. And this term comes up in your text and will come up throughout any type of sociology course that you take, right? And the concept is difficult to just kind of define in a textbook way, which is why we're doing this whole lecture where you can have a chance to ask questions and get clarification on it. And it's very multifaceted. And so what I mean by that is it's not just one thing, right? So, but the heart of what the sociological imagination is and what it signifies within the discipline of sociology is that it doesn't just describe the practice of sociology, but it is explaining how we want to practice sociology effectively, right? So I write here that specifically what Mills argues in his book, and it is an entire book dedicated to this concept, is to analyze how the experiences that we have as individuals, right? So think of the question that I asked you, what did you have for breakfast? That we can link all of these experiences, all of these events that we all as people, right, as members of society experience, that we can link all of these things to these broader patterns and forces, right? So there's a whole lot of terminology to break down patterns and forces even more. So it would be things like norms, rules, customs, traditions, culture, right? And so what Mills is arguing that the sociological imagination is that it is a practice, and it is practicing a particular way of thinking and analyzing, right? So being able to make this link and see how the individual experiences is connected to the society that you're a part of. The other thing, and this is what makes it multifaceted, that Mills argues is central to the sociological imagination, is that in addition to seeing how the individual, right, is connected and part of the society, that the time period, right, the actual time period and what is happening within that time period, right, is equally as important for us to understand all kinds of experiences that people have or don't have, right? So I realize this is all still a little bit vague, but the key thing here is to understand that the sociological imagination is essentially a way to describe what it means to think or to analyze as a sociologist, right? And that this requires linking individual experiences to social patterns and also taking into consideration the historical moment or the time period. And this is a quote from his book. And it just essentially restates how necessary it is for us to connect history and biography. So biography is how Mills talks about, the individual life, right? The things that an individual will go through and experience in their life. And that while they seem and feel very personal to us because they are our individual experiences in our lives, that they are in fact largely shaped by society and history. All right. So this is a quote that I think really represents the heart of the sociological imagination. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, and you'll have access to it, but we'll come back to this later. And it really does include everything, right? He talks about how the sociological imagination, it's part of social science, right? Which a lot of people might kind of lose sight of when they hear the word sociology, or they kind of think of that, right? That it's not the same. Sociology is not the same as journalism, right? It's not the same as history, right? It's a social science. And part of the practice of sociology and what makes it different from psychology, what makes it different from economics, what makes it different from anthropology, right, is what he is describing here, right? That an individual can understand their own experience and their fate by locating themselves within a particular time period, right? A historical moment. And then also looking at those who they are most similar to, right? And that's the part of sociology that makes it a social science, right? It's like looking at trends, looking at data, looking at patterns, looking at how rates change and decrease, right? And that all of this stuff together is what makes up the sociological imagination. All right, so there are two key concepts that Mills uses in his writing. I did include a short article. It's an excerpt from his book that's on La Lima. And it does have this information in it as well. It's not required reading, but it's definitely something that will be helpful for you to kind of skim over. And especially after this lecture and conversation that we have, it'll make a little more sense to you. And so Mills talks about um, the way we can understand how the sociological imagination functions is with these concepts of personal troubles and social issues. And so he outlines what these are and what they look like, not just in our own lives, but throughout society. So a personal trouble is characterized as a perspective, right? If you have this perspective on life, you are likely going to understand problems as the source of problems come from an individual, right? It's a very individual level type of analysis and explanation, right? And that problems that an individual experiences, whether it's yours or someone else's, the thinking goes, this is a private matter, and it really doesn't have anything to do with me or anybody else. So an example that Mills, he has these classic examples that he uses in his book, and he talks about both divorce and homelessness. And he uses these examples to illuminate how the sociological imagination can allow us and enable us to analyze those troubles in a more complex way, right? So, Hawaii has a very, very high rate of homelessness here. For any of you who have spent any amount of time, you've probably noticed that and are aware of it. And it's, so you've probably at some point in your life had an experience, or maybe you've had people in your family or yourself who have experienced housing insecurity. And you are probably very familiar with the stigma and the ideas that surround homelessness, right? And those ideas that are fairly mainstream and common about people's like work ethic, whether they have substance addiction issue, substance use or addiction problems, gambling, things of that nature. All of those associations with homelessness or being homeless fall in this category, right, of the personal trouble, right? It's identifying the individual as the source of the problem, right, or the reason that they're experiencing that situation, and not really considering how not just you as an individual, but how anything else in society relates to that issue, that trouble of being homeless. And so Mills, he gives this example of homelessness, and he says, well, if one person is homeless, right, then it's definitely a personal trouble, right? We could statistically make that assessment, right? But if thousands of people are homeless and there are rates of homelessness that remain rather consistent, right, across time and across space, well, then it's no longer just an individual trouble, right, or a private matter. It's a social issue, right? And so the view of understanding something as a social issue is the perspective that sociologists take, right? Our theories are informed by this, our research design, right? Where the sociological analysis is going to be looking for these patterns, right? And at the time of this writing in 1959, homelessness was a social issue in the US, and it's gotten worse, right? It's only gotten worse since this came out, right? But it is still, there are still very consistent patterns in terms of where people are homeless, the experiences that people have that lead them to homelessness, um, how difficult it is to get out of being homeless, right? These are all things that are very patterned and established throughout society. And so this is taking a group or societal level analysis, right, as opposed to only looking at the individual. And this lens of analysis is going to take into consideration, the politics surrounding the issue, economic factors. Right now, we are in a pandemic. The economy is not doing well. It hasn't been for a year now, and it's not going to recover anytime soon, right? And the number of people who have faced, and not just in Hawaii, right, in the whole US, but a number of people who have trouble paying rent, who have lost their jobs, who are facing and or battling eviction, and are now housing and food insecure, has gone through the roof, right? And that's where the historical level, element of this analysis is so important, right? There are many, many things that I'm sure you can think of that have completely changed because of the pandemic that we are still currently in, right? And so the fallout, I guess, which is, we're still in it, it's not over. Um, it's going to significantly alter the course of many things, right? So things like the number of students enrolling in college, it's changing. The number of people who are out of work, right, is going, it's been high for a long time. It's going to take a long time to recover that from that. And all of these things that are happening right now are specific to this historical time period that we are in, right? And then social factors, those of course, politics and the economy and history is social, but other ways that we can think of social factors that influence an experience that someone's happening would be something like, what are the cultural norms, right, attached to that particular issue, right? Like what do people think of when it comes to homelessness or divorce, right? And we can see that these patterns change over time, right? The change is usually slow and incremental, but there are changes, right? So Mills, as he introduces these concepts, personal troubles and social issues, is kind of giving us a template to better understand how to practice thinking sociologically, right? It's the ability to make this connection between the personal and the social, right? Or the individual and the social. in our analysis. And that is the lecture. That's all of the information that I wanted to go over with you all. So I'm going to